Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Markets and Morality, the IEA series where we take a look at the social and economic issues that divide left from right and right between itself. I'm Emma Revell, Head of Public Affairs at the Institute of Economic Affairs, and today I'm going to be asking, does the hereditary principle have any place in modern British public life? Whilst overall support for the monarchy remains high in the UK, recent polls have shown that 19% of Brits favour abolishing the institution, and the British Social Attitude Survey has found a marked shift in recent decades between the number of people who say that their support for the monarchy is very important for the UK, down to just quite important. Has the focus on social mobility, levelling up and inequality meant Brits are more likely to wave goodbye to the Windsors? We also have 92 hereditary peers, all of them male, sitting in the House of Lords with their right to debate and pass legislation determined purely by chance. Is it right that lawmakers should be determined purely because they're the eldest son or nephew or grandson of a previous lawmaker? To pick apart the future of the monarchy and critique certain parts of the House of Lords, I'm joined by two passionate guests who are both really great friends of the IEA. Previously a campaign manager at the Taxpayers Alliance, James Price left think tank world and joined the government as a special advisor to the leader of the House of Lords before becoming a senior account director at Hanover Communications. Rebecca Lowe is currently writing her doctoral thesis on property rights and was previously a director of FREA, a think tank advocating economically and socially liberal ideas. Welcome both. Thanks very much for joining me. You both, all of my guests on all episodes of this show, come from what would broadly be considered the right of politics, but within that we find a lot of different views. So I'll start by asking you both how you would label your individual politics and also to give us your elevator pitch for your side of the question today. James, do you want to kick off?
Happily. In terms of labelling myself, I'm probably quite boring down the line Thatcherite, as my design of my flat, you can see over my shoulder, will attest. In terms of a lift pitch, I won't go with the elevator pitch. I think that it's important in something like a proper discussion about things like the royals, not to just say, well, God put her there, so it's okay that the Queen rules, because that would be silly. And I think that it's important to acknowledge that on some levels, of course, the kind of pomp and ceremony is silly and anachronistic and outdated. And I'm sure there are lots of kind of intellectual American elites who'll be watching some of this and saying how ridiculous it is that a modern state still has a kind of hereditary monarchy, let alone hereditary members of the House of Lords, that we can talk about a bit later. But I'm not sure how much sillier that really is compared to, say, investing all of the pomp and grandeur, say, of the French state in a figure like Emmanuel Macron, or how potentially good that is for his ego or his ability, therefore, to make decisions on things, to say nothing of any of the American presidents we've had recently. I think that the kind of pomp and ceremony and all that stuff, which I think is very fun and very appealing, is better kept because that's a kind of tradition that has been built up and has its own sort of social and cultural utilities to it over a long period of time, but keep that separate from the day-to-day decision-making of things. I think the system, the kind of blancmange that we've got of a kind of constitutional monarchy that's come out of our settlement from sort of 1688 onwards really has kind of worked very well for us. I think the evidence has borne that out. We might have just got lucky with people like Elizabeth and Queen Victoria and so on, but compare that to some of the tumultuousness, say, of our French cousins across the sea, of the many republics they've tried to get through. And I think at time of recording, there are some French generals who are considering a coup d'etat even now, something that would be unthinkable here or in the Netherlands or any of the other places that have constitutional monarchies still. And so the arguments I think I'm going to make through this are going to be a lot squishier than you'll find probably normally in IEA output, but I don't think they're any less important for that.
Hey, we like squishy arguments as well. Rebecca, what about you?
So addressing your first question about labelling, I'm not mad keen on labels, but I'm happy to make some kind of distinction between like identifying as and being described as. And I guess I say, well, I mean, my fundamental commitments are to basic equality and freedom, but I think probably most people would describe me, at least economically, somewhere on the right, in that I'm in favour of free markets with conditions and stuff. But yeah. In terms of the monarchy, so I'm going to be upfront and say I'm not really very interested in whether the Queen is good at her job or not. I don't care whether she's beneficent or smart or better at what she does in any of these kinds of senses than anyone else, because for me, if she were, that simply wouldn't be enough for me to support her remaining in position. I mean, let's take James here. So he's super smart, he's very funny, he dresses nicely, he's even quite wise, I've noticed. And I'm pretty sure actually he'd be better than me at doing a lot of the things that I currently do, including maybe running my finances, directing my house, decorating my house, deciding whether I join the organ donor list or whether I opt out, choosing my sexual partners for me, taking charge of any kids I decide to have. But just because he might have relevant qualifications here in terms of his, I would admit, superior personal qualities to me, does that mean he should be doing these things? No, he has no authority to do so. And for him to take over and start to do these things would, I would argue, be an egregious misuse of power. That's bad enough in the private domain between friends like me and James. But when it comes to political power, that is what I'm interested in talking about today. So the justification of political power. And I want to use the same principles that I'd use for determining, say, whether a political regime is legitimate to question the justification of monarchy. So to me, a necessary condition, not a sufficient one, but a necessary condition of a legitimate political regime is that it respects every societal member's basic equal political rights to deliberative participation. I get not everyone agrees with me on this. There are some authoritarians out there, but I'd hope that James does at least. I don't think he's anti-democratic. I should say at this point, I do get that other people look at monarchy in other ways. They use different approaches on which their assessment of whether they should support it or not is indeed related to stuff like whether it's effective or nice or brings in the cash or its value of history to a culture, these kinds of things. But I just don't think these are first order issues. You can be as great a ruler as you like, but if you don't have authority in a legitimate manner, it's irrelevant. It's just like my example of James running my life, no matter how great he might be at doing so. So what really matters, I contend, is the justification of political power and not just the way it's exercised. And for political power to be justified, it has to be sufficiently respectful of the rights over those over whom it's exercised. And part of that is that they get to have a say about who holds the power and what the power holder does with it. In other words, it's conditionally held. The governed must determine the governor's appointment and their continued holding of power. Power holders must be able to be held to account. They must be replaceable. So what I'm arguing basically is that the only legitimate political regime is democracy and that hereditary leadership is simply illegitimate within that. It's out of kilter with the conditions I mentioned. You can't vote a monarch out, you can't choose them. Indeed, the hereditary method preferences one tiny set of people all from the same family. So it's worse than just chance. It's not aleatoric. I mean, beyond the fact that we all happen to be born who we are, and it comes all down one family line. It's simply corrupt. It's also massively exclusionary in a way that's hardly in line with that principle of equal respect, equal value of all societal members that's so crucial. Beyond that, to be honest, I have general problems with all kinds of hereditary stuff. I'm actually in favor of super high inheritance tax, for instance, controversially, and I'm keen also to talk about House of Lords reform at some point today. But my basic argument is that this monarchy thing is nothing to do with how effective a form of political power the monarchy can be, or how nice the Queen seems, or effects on GDP, or anything like that. One final thing I should add, sorry, I know I'm probably going over time, is that I just think it's empty to support stuff just because it's been there a long time. I mean, I understand the classic conservative arguments about the value of stability, but stability cannot be enough in itself. You need something more. I mean, you don't want to continue having a tradition of, say, like murdering kittens just because it's always been that way. This kind of reasoning leads not only to ignoring horrific wrongs, but also props up dangerous relativism, which says, hey, well, it seems pretty nasty, but it's got to be okay because they do it. Similarly, not enough to say, well, the monarchy's popular. Technically, we could band together and, vote her out. But just because something's popular doesn't make it democratic. There are basic preconditions to democracy, including like respecting those basic equal political rights and so on. If you vote those things out, you're no longer in a proper democracy. So a democracy, for instance, that decides to start ignoring the rights, political rights, minorities to vote is acting undemocratically. And I would argue that a democracy which involves unelected, hereditary, political power holders of any kind is also undemocratic. So to conclude, I do get that the UK brand of monarchy is less bad than many. It's better than those countries in which the monarch is treated as a god and people like starve while while gold statues are built to the god king. But just because something's less bad doesn't make it okay. The bad monarchy and the super good monarchy both suffer from this same fatal flaw. It's an illegitimate use of authority, an unjustified form of political power. No space for it, totally done, over and out.
I mean, that's a much better summary than I was going to go with, which was, we're in favour of James running your life, not in favour of killing kittens.
I'm not in favour of him running my life either, even though he probably would be much better at me than doing it. I just don't think the effects would outweigh the unjustification for it.
It's very dangerous to tell him you think he'd be good at that. Rebecca, your position is very much built on principle. It's not swayed by who currently wears the crown. I mean, very few people around nowadays remember a time before Queen Elizabeth anyway. But do you think people's views are swayed by the individuals in office? So, a lot of countries outside the UK, Canada and Australia, for example, if they talk about replacing the royal family or getting rid of the monarchy, it is always after the Queen is gone, because the Queen is very personally popular. Do you think the fact that the Queen is popular makes it harder to make the argument that you're making because people go, oh, but she's really nice, or we really like her?
I mean, I think, the Queen's personal approval ratings definitely help. She has like probably the highest approval ratings. I think even my old friend Ben Houchin up in the Northeast, who's just got like 110% of the Teesside vote, probably isn't as popular as the Queen. But again, I mean, that's just not enough for me. Like I say, there have been many times when a load of people have said that something's okay and they've done it. That just doesn't make it democratic. So popularity is indeed often used to measure the value of things in democracies. I just don't think that's always an appropriate thing to do. There are certain preconditions you can't get rid of. So yeah, I totally accept this, and I'm well aware that the rate of support for abolishing the monarchy has remained abysmally low. But all the more reason, I'd say, to make the kinds of arguments I'm making rather than those just based on effect. Or indeed, I'm sure the Queen is a very nice person, but similarly, James is a nice person. Don't want him running my life. Sorry, James.
We really need to stop giving James this ego boost. It's going to go to his head.
Win a debate. Be nice to your opponent.
See him smiling away there. I mean, the monarch has two roles in the UK. They are the head of state, but also the head of the nation. Do you think if we had a situation where the constitutional powers of the monarch were removed, but the kind of pomp and ceremony bit, the royal family remain as figureheads, James, do you think that would be a good compromise between your and Rebecca's positions? Or are you very firmly on your side of the fence?
Well, I think it'd be very hard to tell. And Rebecca said something very interesting there, that was you shouldn't be in favour of something just because it's been that way for a long time. But things don't just remain as they are for a long time. The royal family, of course, we're going to keep using this as one example, changes and moves with the times and somehow manages to expel fewer, some of the kind of less good aspects of it. Maybe Prince Harry could be put in that camp, and people like William and co have started talking about their feelings more, and those sorts of things have changed, and it's changed a lot over the past, but it's changed because it's adapted and it's managed to remain popular by doing things like that. But I think it's always really fun, because I like to think of myself as quite out there and quite radical on various policies, and whenever I debate with Rebecca, it makes me realize what a kind of fusty, dusty old sort of Shire Tory I really am. But I don't think that you can just kind of throw away some of these things, as you say there, Emma, like attenuating out the two different roles, whatever, because they are part and parcel of it. And that idea of the monarch or the royal family is something to do with the nation as well. It's not just for the benefit of the monarch or the nation, it's for the people themselves. And people, by and large, as we said, the monarchy is popular, not just because it's been there for a long time. It's popular because people manage to put their own ideas and values and things like that onto the monarchy. In the same way that Homer never says what Helen of Troy looks like, so people can always put the kind of idealized beautiful woman that they would go to war with or go to war for. People manage to put what they sort of hope the Queen might think about these things onto themselves, and a clever kind of monarch can do that as well, and they will sense the tone of the nation and move accordingly like that. So I think it's a mistake not to ever kind of attenuate that kind of popularity and say that's not a really good reason for keeping it as it is.
Rebecca, what do you think? Do you think there's a compromise, or are you diametrically opposed to the two of you?
I think we're diametrically opposed. But one thing I would point out is I often hear people making this point around. In fact, I actually looked on the UK Parliament site earlier today, and it's fair enough. Sure enough, it says the role of the Crown is broadly ceremonial these days. That said, we all know that there are certain constitutional powers that the Queen exercises in terms of giving royal assent to bills, opening, closing Parliament, giving the nod to the government of the day, these things. Now, obviously there is vast scholarly debate about to what extent this is real, to what extent this is, just kind of some nice kind of fairy story. But the very fact that there is a debate about this, I would argue, means there's a problem here. There's a sort of epistemic problem in terms of what people understand. And we saw this with, American newspapers being like, gee, Lizzie's in favor of this and stuff, which is concerning, and particularly concerning if people have those confusions here. At the moment, I would say there's arguments about transparency and stuff, but I think the point stands that there is power. There's also issues of overreach. I mean, the famous Charles spidery letters and stuff. Famous example of the Queen's representative in Australia, the Governor General, sacking the Gough Whitlam government in 1975. Again, I'm sure you'll have all kinds of Australian constitutional scholars writing in and saying there's debate about that. But there's no doubt the Queen exercises power. You can call it ceremonial if you want, because she, dresses in diamonds, which I personally also think really does. It speaks of like the kind of the country squire with all the money and stuff. I would say it's out of date, but it's not just out of date because it was always wrong.
James, let's bring financials into it. So surely as free marketeers, we should be in favour of welcoming any moves to bring a large and expanding family, off reliance on the public purse and getting them out into the world, having their own jobs, earning their own money. Do you think financially the royal family is worth it? Because there are arguments, either saying how much the royal family cost Britain, but also the kind of how much money they bring into the country through tourism and that kind of argument.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that the numbers probably speak for themselves largely. If you look at the number of tourists who flock to Buckingham Palace, the fact that the members that certainly go to Windsor, and all those kind of, it's the sort of the sprinkling of fairy dust on the UK that makes it sort of that old school charm that so many people like. I personally think that if you were to abolish the monarchy, you'd have to give them back all of their lands. And so the kind of crown estate that brings in hundreds of millions for the exchequer every year, and it doesn't really ever get talked about. And I think almost presents a kind of one of the few retorts to kind of IEA orthodoxy, in that the people that work for the Crown Estates, they don't see much of that profit themselves because it's returned to the Exchequer, and yet it does make a surplus, I think very healthy surplus every year. It's almost like people working for a God-appointed monarch like Her Majesty. It seems at least as powerful a driver as the profit motive, and maybe the IEA could devote some research times to this. But I think that Rebecca would be right when she says that it shouldn't be about the money on these sorts of issues. But here, think of it like this: how much money would you have to spend on what kind of resources or structure to get a psychologist or a sort of experienced therapist or something who would be as helpful to Boris Johnson in the middle of a pandemic, to Theresa May in the middle of the crisis that she was in over Brexit, to Tony Blair in the Iraq War, whatever else it may be over the last God knows how many decades, that would be as useful or as helpful as someone like the Queen, disinterested, not uninterested, and dispassionate, saying useful bits of advice, suggestions, and giving that long arc of history to a prime minister in very candid moments, presumably one of the very few people a prime minister could ever trust. And that would be, it is quite literally, money can't buy help. And so I think those, again, I said that I would make squishy arguments, but I nevertheless think that would be a very, very useful thing that can never be replicated in the same way. Even if you had someone, the closest America kind of has to that is what, Henry Kissinger, who is an incredibly controversial figure even today. And the Queen just doesn't have that kind of baggage, ironically, for someone who probably has so many kind of baggage handlers.
Well, also it's what she gives to the country as well. I mean, there will be a number of people who over the last year have stopped watching Boris Johnson's COVID press conferences because they find them too depressing or what have you. But the amount of people I think who tuned in to see the Queen when she did an address early last year saying, we need to bring the nation together. I know many more people who tuned in for that because it was important. Rebecca, I know you said the financials don't matter, but do you want to talk briefly about the cost of the royal family, or we can move on?
I just don't think it's a good, or certainly not sufficient metric. I would also just add, about the impossibility of comparing. I mean, there's no counterfactual here. It's always hard to assess things in terms of literal, direct causal costs and benefits. But you don't have a counterfactual against which to judge that, so that's even harder, right? So I'd say that's very that it's kind of. It's about it's like when people talk about the overall net benefit of Christmas or something. You don't have a counterfactual. It's very hard to assess. But yeah, I mean, basically, I don't think that's a good argument. I mean, James's point is a very nice one, I think, around the comfort and solace and advice the Queen might be able to give in a disinterested and dispassionate way. It's very contingent on who the monarch currently is, though. And I don't really want to go into this kind of argument because I personally am trying to stick to this more purist fundamental point. But I would just point out, that Prince Charles, who's going to be our next monarch, has been pretty overtly political. And I think that's very problematic if your argument is based on this kind of condition of disinterest. I'd wonder what James would think to that. I mean, we all know what Charles, even if he suddenly claims he's gone all neutral, we know what he thinks about things. And we also know that he has, exerted undue influence in terms of those little spidery letters and stuff. Maybe it was just about birds and butterflies, but it's inappropriate, it's wrong.
James, what do you think about that? Because, you mentioned the royals are getting more open talking about things. Arguably, that is more political sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same way that isn't George R.R. Martin's criticism of Tolkien is that he's saying, what is Aragorn's tax code policy or something like that. And you don't want you to get monarchs getting into the kind of the weeds on all of this sort of stuff. I do think that the various kinds of, and I'll keep using the word squishy, I think it's better than most of the things, the pageantry around, say, being finally appointed king if and when one day it actually happens with Charles, that will have an effect, because we know that ceremony and ritual and all those sort of things don't just happen because they're nice and pretty, because they put a level of sort of sonorousness onto an occasion, a somberness, and reminding Charles that heavy is the head that wears the crown and all those sorts of things. And so I think that all that pageantry and pomp will have an effect on that. And I think at the very least, we don't know what the nature of conversations are like between and I know we're making this a very kind of British-centric thing, but I'm fairly confident that the sort of heads of government will talk to heads of state if they're monarchs anyway. That kind of longer span of history is still useful, regardless of who the people are, even if they're kind of complete morons. Asking questions will be helpful to a prime minister to kind of clarify and to have to justify in an honest manner, rather than the sort of the noise and heat of something like prime minister's questions or something like that. So that kind of dynamic, and again, that's a system that has built up over an awfully long time, privy councillors and all those sorts of things, and it's existed and it's survived because it's so useful and so effective.
So I'm going to move on to the House of Lords. And as I said in the introduction, we have 92 hereditary peers currently sitting in the House of Lords as a result of some half-hearted and aborted attempt at reform under New Labour and Tony Blair. James, you've worked with quite a lot of these peers very closely. Rebecca and I will have undoubtedly worked with them at various points. And while they individually can contribute a great deal, do you think they have a right to be there, regardless of what they may or may not contribute to legislation?
Well, again, obviously on some level, it's just incredibly silly to have dukes and earls and your great grand titles sat around talking about the minutiae of a kind of farming bill, or you get the wonderful things at the Queen's speech where Her Majesty has to read out something about psychoactive substances and all these very modern words that get put in her mouth. There's something quite funny and grounding about a lot of that, I think. And if any of your viewers and listeners hear the wind whistling on this video, it's going to the chip on my shoulder as a kind of Arab East state school boy who would hate the fact of what I'm about to say, which is that the hereditary peers by and large tend to be much better, more hardworking, more conscientious, more alive to their constitutional role, the limits of their power, than any of the life peers tend to be. And I think it was Viscount Ridley, a friend of the IEA, who, in a retort to someone saying, well, you're only here because your great-grandfather helped win the Battle of Waterloo or something like that. And he replied saying, well, you're only here because Tony Blair quite liked you. So I don't think in terms of having any kind of appointed house necessarily that these things are any bigger problem than the other. And the last thing I'd say on it is that a lot of these people tend to, or they certainly before the reforms happened, they knew that they would become the Lord so-and-so. And so they were kind of groomed for it and hopefully were groomed often most of the time to be conscious of that constitutional role and their limits therein. Whereas if you're a kind of ex-prime minister or even just an ex-MP who gets booted up to the upper house, you have too much of a sort of sense that actually, no, I'm going to go and change things and everything like that. And that kind of long lead-in time, I would suggest, makes someone much more suited for legislative scrutiny and things like that than someone who perhaps wins an unexpected parliamentary seat. Maybe we'll talk, for a different video about the problems of selecting people to run for parliament and some of the quality of the lower house that we get as well. It's maybe for another time.
Yeah, well, I don't want to delve too deeply into Lords reform because I think it will make a great video in and of itself. But it's interesting that you talked about, being groomed for it and having that time to prepare for that role. If we look at the hereditary Lords, the average age is 71. Nearly half of them went to Eton, and between them, they own 170,000 acres of land, which is nearly half the size of Greater London. Rebecca, is it right that people who are not representative really in any way of the British public have such a small but prominent role in the House of Lords?
Yeah, I mean, again, I say that actually the representation is another of those metrics on which I wouldn't want to depend. I think it is problematic in itself. Don't get me wrong. I don't think though if they were representative, that would suffice. I would also, I do agree that there are issues with political appointment, particularly when that appointment procedure has been exercised corruptly, as some of our former prime ministers sadly have, or indeed maybe even current ones sadly have done. That said, I would say in terms of reformed House of Lords, I think there probably is some space for, I think there's, I like the bicameral approach. I think there's some space for, I think we probably do need an upper house of some kind. I'm open to various models here. And I think there probably is some space for political appointment in there, not least because, at least the people appointing them have been elected. So I don't think that should be ruled out automatically. But again, this hereditary decision-making approach, no matter how brilliant the people are, it tends, it selects. It's just not a justified method. Again, like,
but I think these people know that they're not brilliant in lots of ways. That there's because of whatever background that may be.
I'm not saying they're not brilliant. They could be totally brilliant.
And you can have someone like Napoleon who comes along who is undoubtedly very brilliant and therefore thought he could never do any wrong. Whereas if you had Louis the 16th, bless him, kind of knew his limitations in lots of ways, and maybe that was his personal downfall. But that kind of humility is a very vanishingly rare feature of political life these days, and it's almost weirdly in a way quite refreshing to see crusty old men with fancy titles having that level of humility.
I think they could be as humble as brilliant. They could be, the most lovely philosopher kings who are absolutely amazing at absolutely everything. Let's say that we've worked out what the best ruler type is and they are these people. This still doesn't give them the authority to be there doing these things. I also think it undermines any good that they might do. I also think quite strongly that it's bad for them too. I mean, there's the famous master-slave thing being bad for both sides. I think it's infantilizing to both sides. It gives them a position in life which isn't based on desert, and you can have problems with desert itself. I mean, there's a lot of arguments around meritocracy at the moment, for instance. But I would say, to my mind, one of the real problems here is that they don't get to partake in normal political society as an equal. And I think that's damaging to them as it is damaging to the people over them. You look at the, I don't follow royal news very much, but I can't help but notice, that Prince Harry has been talking about his, the problems he's suffered from indeed this burden of hereditary power. I can understand why they might want to fulfill what they see as important obligations. I personally don't actually think they are correctly held obligations. I don't think they are obligations at all, but I can understand why they want to do that. But I just think it's bad for them as well. I think it's damaging for society and it's bad for all involved.
I think these guys get opt-outs though, right? Harry has shown very clearly that he can leave in a big fanfare of all these kind of things. Now with the hereditaries, there is, for some of your viewers that may not know, the very peculiar situation of by-elections when a hereditary peer either dies or retires. There is a peculiar sort of by-election. And I think one of the last times there was a Lib Dem one, there were 6 peers going for one spot with 3 people voting or something.
3 electors, yeah.
3 electors, exactly. But people don't have to do this kind of stuff, and they can choose to bow out of it. It's on their sake. It's because they think that there's this level of obligation and duty, and if they think there is one, and that's still them kind of consenting to it broadly, I would say.
Well, I think if you've got an obligation, that's, you might feel that it's not just a matter of basic choice in terms of your preferences. You feel that, it's something you should do, that there's some kind of normative constraint here. I'd say, actually, I've heard quite a few people make the argument, I appreciate you're not making this argument, James, that, the hereditary peers, at least they're democratically elected. But that's kind of like saying, well, hey, the murder company in which, the murderers choose their CEO democratically, therefore is the best murder company, and therefore murder companies are okay. Sorry, I'm not going to.
But I think we'd go into an argument about first past the post or about our whole kind of representative democracy itself. But the Labour Party in the last election had get rid of the House of Lords and replace it with a Senate, which sounds so awfully po-faced and boring and miserable that one of the major reasons I'm glad they didn't do it, regardless of other problems with the Lords. The Lib Dems have been saying get rid of it for a long time. The Tories have sort of said, yeah, we'll do something about it at some point and try not to talk about it too much. But it doesn't seem to be a particularly live issue for people. And I'm sure that with all of the ludicrousness of it all that you argue for very eloquently, that if people were really exercised by it, then a campaign to get rid of them would be much more popular than it is. And I think that, is it Republic, the name of the main sort of Republican group? Every time that they get, they come and speak on something, support for the monarchy seems to go up. And so we talk about kind of, what is the difference between you say that popularity isn't good enough, but you also need some kind of lever on this. What would you do to get rid of it? People can say they want to get rid of the monarchy, they always get voted down. They want to get rid of the House of Lords, they always get voted down. Maybe the only thing worse than changing any of this stuff would be keeping it. Was the only thing worse than keeping it the same would be changing it at all?
So, I mean, I'd just argue that, it's enough just to recognise that it's unjustified to get rid of it. I don't think you need anything more than that. Beyond that, I would say, look, I totally agree with you about the need to assess and reform the mechanisms by which our form of democracy works. And yet they're by no means perfect. I have some time for those arguments where people say, in fact, they're so bad that they mean that we don't effectively have a democracy. Personally, I think, I could talk about this all day, but I would like, first of all, I think to separate out those questions about the way in which our particular democracy manifested and the conditions that are necessary for a democracy. I think it's really important to make that distinction before you then go to assessing the justification for any particular manifestation of it.
Well, that's a great debate. Thanks so much. I think some of these episodes of Markets and Morality were sort of going to compromise and meet in the middle, and some, like this one, were just going to outline two diametrically opposed views and let our viewers decide which one, if either, has convinced them. Thanks, James, and thanks, Rebecca, for joining me, and thanks to our viewers for watching, as well as subscribing to the IEA YouTube channel, which I encourage you all to do. You can now support the IEA on Patreon, an online membership platform that allows our followers to donate purely to support our digital work, including shows such as this. You'll get exclusive perks, IEA benefits, and priority access to our content, including the opportunity to watch this show 24 hours before anyone else. If you'd like the opportunity to help the IEA continue producing stimulating and educational online content, you can go to patreon.com/IEA London or click the link in the show notes. Thanks for watching.